Lena kept a notebook full of lists of favorite songs, lists of foods she could still taste after heartbreak, lists of people who had once promised her not to leave. The notebook lived in her backpack beside a half-charged phone and 3 different lip glosses because Lena believed in being prepared for reinvention. Some mornings she woke up certain she was brilliant, magnetic, and unforgettable. Other moments she stared at herself in the bathroom mirror and felt like someone had erased the outline around her body. At 26, she could fall in love before a coffee order was finished. Or maybe it wasn't love. Maybe it was relief. The relief of being seen. She met Eli at a used bookstore during a rainstorm. He was sitting cross-legged on the floor in the philosophy aisle, reading the first page of 5 different books and buying none of them. Lena watched him for 10 minutes before saying, that's literary cheating, right? He looked up and grinned like he'd been waiting for her specifically. By the end of the week, she knew his middle name, his favorite cereal, the scar on his shoulder from falling out of a tree at age 9. By the end of the month, she had imagined their apartment, their dog, the exact shade of green she would paint the kitchen. Eli liked how intensely she lived. At first. Lena made everything feel cinematic. Midnight pancakes, long drives with the windows down, crying during songs neither of them fully understood. She noticed details other people missed. The tiny crack in his phone screen. The way his voice changed when he talked to his mother. The sadness he hid behind jokes. But intensity is difficult to carry forever. One Friday night, Eli took 3 hours to text back. 3 hours. Lena told herself not to panic. People get busy. Phones die. Traffic exists. But another voice inside her whispered, "He's tired of you." The whisper became a roar. By the time he finally replied, "Sorry, work got crazy," she had already convinced herself he hated her. Her chest burned with shame so hot it felt physical. She threw her phone onto the couch, then immediately grabbed it again. She typed, "Forget it." Deleted it. Typed, "Do you even care about me?" Deleted that too. Finally she sent, "It's fine." Happy face emoji. Which was never a good sign. When Eli came over later, tired and unsuspecting, Lena was ice cold. Then furious, then crying, then apologizing for crying, then angry he made her apologize. "I don't know what you want me to do," he said quietly. The moment the words left his mouth, she saw it, the exhaustion in his eyes, and suddenly the fear she'd been running from all evening became real. He's leaving. Panic clawed up her throat. "I knew it," she whispered. "You're just like everybody else." Eli rubbed his face. "Lena, this is what I mean. Everything becomes a catastrophe." That sentence hit her harder than shouting would have, because somewhere beneath the chaos, Lena knew he was right. After he left, she sat on the kitchen floor until sunrise. The apartment felt hollow without another heartbeat inside it. She hated him for making her feel abandoned. She hated herself more for needing anyone this much. Around 4 a.m., she opened the notebook. On the first blank page, she wrote, "I don't know who I am when nobody is looking at me." Then, for reasons she couldn't explain, she started crying harder than before. Not dramatic crying, not angry crying, grieving. Like someone mourning a child they never got to keep. A week later, Lena showed up to therapy wearing sunglasses indoors because she hadn't slept. Her therapist, Dr. Navarro, slid a box of tissues across the table but didn't say anything immediately. She rarely rushed to fill silence. Lena both loved and hated her for that. "I think I ruined people," Lena finally muttered. Dr. Navarro tilted her head. "That sounds like a painful belief." It's true. Or, the therapist said gently, you learned very early that love could disappear unexpectedly, and now your nervous system treats distance like danger. Lena stared at her. Nobody had ever described her reactions as fear before. People called her dramatic, too much, manipulative, unstable, crazy. Fear sounded different. Fear sounded human. Therapy did not fix Lena quickly. There were no miraculous breakthroughs, no movie montage where she suddenly became emotionally balanced while soft music played in the background. There were setbacks. Days she split people into heroes and villains. Nights she sent texts she regretted. Moments she wanted to disappear entirely. But slowly, almost invisibly, she began to notice the space between feeling and reacting. One afternoon, Eli texted after several hours of silence. Lena felt the familiar panic ignite. Her fingers trembled over the keyboard. Then she remembered something Dr. Navarro had taught her. Feelings arrive like weather. They are not instructions. So instead of sending 12 frantic messages, Lena placed the phone face down on the counter and walked outside. The air smelled like orange blossoms and hot pavement. She breathed. The fear was still there, loud, convincing. But for the first time in her life, she did not obey it immediately. And somehow, that tiny moment felt bigger than all the chaos that had come before. Months later, Lena brought another notebook. Not for lists of people who stayed or left. This one was different. On the first page, she wrote, "Things I know are true, even when I'm afraid." The page stayed empty for a long time. Then, slowly, it began to fill. Hello, everyone. I'm Mary, the OG Woo Woo therapist, and I want to welcome you to this week's episode, recorded in my functional but versatile home office that is 1 block from the interstate, where traffic noise is a real thing and can be disruptive. So I apologize in advance for any noise disruptions. And as usual, I have to tell you that everything I talk about today is not intended to take the place of counseling or therapy. It's only for informational purposes. And some of it is based on my personal experiences. However, if you relate to any of the information, do not self-diagnose or diagnose anyone else. If you are disturbed by it, seek a professional to talk to about it. Now, let's take a look at Lena and Eli. Lena's story illustrates many core features associated with borderline personality disorder, while also humanizing the emotional logic underneath the behaviors. This case conceptualization will help to understand both the function of her reactions and the deeper attachment wounds driving them. First, core fear is abandonment. The central emotional engine in Lena's story is not manipulation or attention seeking. It's terror of abandonment. When Eli takes 3 hours to respond, Lena's nervous system interprets the delay as rejection, loss of attachment, emotional danger, confirmation of worthlessness. Her escalation is an attempt to regulate unbearable attachment panic. The thing to remember is that people like Lena may experience perceived distance as emotional annihilation. Be aware that neutral relational events can activate trauma-level distress, and that emotional responses are often survival-based rather than intentionally controlling. Second, identity disturbance. Lena writes, "I don't know who I am when nobody is looking at me." This is a profound example of unstable self-concept. Possible manifestations including shifting identity based on relationships, mirroring others' unstable goals or values, chronic emptiness, and intense shame when alone. For therapists working with Lena, The counseling focus would be to strengthen internal identity formation, increase self-definition independent of relationships, and build continuity of self across emotional states. Third, splitting and/or black and white thinking. Lena rapidly shifts between adulation, he understands me completely, and devaluation, he's just like everyone else. This is a classic splitting defense where others are experienced as all good or all bad, depending on attachment security, and nuance disappears under emotional activation. The thing to remember here, especially for therapists, is to avoid taking sudden devaluation personally. Emotional consistency from the therapist is critical, and the therapist becomes a model for relational stability. An example of this in my own practice is when I had a client who was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, reached out and left a voicemail on my phone. And my message on my phone clearly states that I will return the call within 24 to 48 hours. However, by the time I returned that call about 3 hours later, she was emotionally distraught, and I was the worst therapist ever. And she was going to quit services with me and find someone who was more responsive. Needless to say, she stayed with me for another 5 years. Fourth, emotional reasoning. Lena feels abandoned. Therefore, abandonment becomes fact. One of the things I tell my clients all the time is feelings aren't facts. This is common in emotionally dysregulated clients, however, where feelings become evidence. Interpretations rapidly crystallize, and imagined rejection feels neurologically real. The counseling intervention here is to help the client distinguish emotions, interpretations, and objective facts. The most used therapy for borderline personality disorder is dialectical behavioral therapy, or DBT. Here are some DBT-based treatment suggestions. DBT is particularly effective because it balances validation, your pain makes sense, with change. Your behaviors are hurting you. The dual approach reduces shame while encouraging accountability. Here are the skills and techniques that the therapist will help someone like Lena build. 1. Mindfulness skills. The clinical goal here is to help Lena observe emotions without immediately reacting. An example intervention would be when Lena notices panic after delayed texting. Instead of rapid texting, accusations, self-harm impulses, and emotional spiraling, Lena would be encouraged to practice pausing. Label the emotion. Notice body sensations and observe thoughts non-judgmentally, like when she went outside and took a breath and noticed that the air smelled like orange blossoms and hot pavement. A useful DBT skill would be to observe and describe. An example of doing this would be for Lena to say, I notice tightness in my chest. I notice the thought that Eli is leaving. I feel fear. Not, he definitely hates me. The goal is to reduce emotional fusion. Distress tolerance skills. Lena's emotional pain becomes intolerable very quickly. DBT teaches Lena to say, how do I survive the moment without making it worse? Skills that fit Lena are TIPP skills. The acronym TIP stands for 4 distinct physical interventions. First T, temperature, rapidly changing your body temperature, e.g. flashing ice cold water on your face or holding an ice pack over your eyes and cheeks, triggers the mammalian drive reflex. This slows your heart rate and physically forces your nervous system to calm down in as little as 30 seconds. I, intense exercise. Short bursts of intense physical activity like jumping jacks, push-ups, or a quick run help burn off excess stress hormones like adrenaline, making it easy for your body to relax. P, paced breathing. Controlling your breathing pattern, such as breathing in through your nose for 4 seconds and breathing out slowly through your mouth for 6 seconds. This signals safety to your brain and lowers your heart rate. The second P, progressive or paired muscle relaxation. Deliberately tensing and then completely releasing different muscle groups in your body helps you recognize physical tension and release built-up stress. These are useful during acute abandonment panic. These reduce physiological arousal quickly. Self-soothing because clients with BPD often lack internal soothing capacity. Some suggestions for self-soothing include a weighted blanket, calming music playlists, grounding scents, sensory kits, and structured routines. I often recommend for my clients that they get a Ziploc bag and put scented soaps in there, or a cloth that they sprayed their favorite perfume on, or if there's some smell from their childhood that represents safety to them, to soak something in whatever that is. For me, it was the smell of cinnamon and cloves. And soak a cloth in that and then put it in the baggie and then take a smell of that whenever they are feeling that panic. Third, emotional regulation. Lena experiences emotions as overwhelming and permanent. The counseling focus includes building awareness that emotions are temporary, emotions contain information, and emotions are survivable. Useful skill is to check the facts. An example of this is noticing the feeling of, he's abandoning me. Then check the facts. What is the evidence? Eli responded later than usual. No evidence of breakup, and alternative explanations exist. This helps separate trigger from reality. Fourth, interpersonal effectiveness. Lena's attachment behaviors unintentionally push others away. A counselor can teach Lena communication that balances needs, boundaries, self-respect, DBT skills, and dear man. For example, instead of you don't care about me, Lena might learn, describe, we hadn't texted for several hours, express, I felt anxious and disconnected, assert, could you let me know if you'll be unavailable, reinforce, that reassurance helps me stay grounded. This reduces escalation while preserving attachment. DEAR. Fifth, radical acceptance. One of the hardest realities for Lena, people cannot provide constant reassurance. Relationships include uncertainty, and emotional pain cannot be eliminated entirely. Radical acceptance does not mean approving of suffering. It means this moment is painful, and fighting reality is increasing suffering. This skill can reduce frantic avoidance of abandonment, rage spirals, and shame collapses. Sixth, the therapist's stance matters immensely. Clients like Lena are highly sensitive to tone changes, inconsistency, perceived criticism, and emotional withdrawal. Helpful counselor qualities are calm consistency, clear boundaries, validation without rescuing, non-reactivity, and predictability. A therapist becomes a corrective relational experience. Here is an important clinical reframe. One of the most therapeutic shifts for clients with BPD is moving from I'm crazy to my nervous system learned survival strategies that no longer serve me. This reduces toxic shame while preserving responsibility for behavior. Here's an example DBT reflection a counselor might use. Your reactions make sense given how intensely you experience attachment and fear. The goal isn't to stop feeling deeply. The goal is to help you feel deeply without being destroyed by the feeling or acting in ways that hurt you or others. The balance is often where healing begins. Using the story of Lena, tell me what contributed to her BPD as a childhood. Okay, well, Lena's story strongly suggests that her borderline personality disorder did not emerge out of nowhere. In most psychological models, BPD develops through a combination of biological emotional sensitivity, attachment disruption, chronic invalidation, relational trauma, inconsistent caregiving. The story hints at several childhood experiences that may have shaped Lena's nervous system and identity. First, let's talk about unpredictable or inconsistent attachment. One of the clearest clues is this line: "You learned very early that love could disappear unexpectedly." Children develop emotional security when caregivers are predictable, emotionally available, responsive, and safe during distress. Lena likely experienced caregivers who were emotionally inconsistent, loving sometimes, rejecting others, unavailable during emotional needs, frightening, shaming, or unstable. As a child, this can create hypervigilance, fear of abandonment, anxious attachment, and emotional dependency. The child learns connection is unstable. I must cling tightly or I'll be left. So as an adult, a delayed text feels neurologically similar to childhood abandonment. Second is emotional invalidation. Children learn emotional regulation from co-regulation with caregivers. If Lena's emotions were repeatedly dismissed with messages like, "You're too sensitive," "Stop being dramatic," "Calm down," "You're overreacting," "Nothing's wrong," then she may never have learned how to name emotions, how to tolerate distress, how to self-soothe, and that emotions are survivable. Instead, she likely learned, "My feelings are wrong, shameful, or too much." And this creates the painful paradox often seen in BPD. Emotions become enormous internally, while the person simultaneously feels ashamed for having them. Then we have to consider possible narcissistic or self-involving parenting. Lena's unstable sense of self suggests she may not have been allowed to develop a separate identity safely. Children of narcissistic or emotionally immature parents often learn love is conditional, approval must be earned. This role is emotionally to manage the parent, and their needs inconvenience others. This can create chronic emptiness, people-pleasing, identity confusion, fear of rejection, and intense shame. Lena's statement, "I don't know who I am when nobody is looking at me," suggests her identity may have formed around being needed, being wanted, being emotionally important to others, rather than developing from a stable internal self. Next, fear-based nervous system development. Lena's reactions are not simply cognitive, they are physiological. When Eli doesn't text back, panic floods her body, catastrophic thinking accelerates, and shame activates instantly. This suggests a childhood nervous system shamed by chronic relational stress. Possibilities include walking on eggshells, emotionally predictability at home, explosive caregivers, emotional neglect, and intermittent affection and rejection. Children in these environments often become highly attuned to tone changes, facial expressions, distance, silence, and perceived rejection. The nervous system becomes trained to scan constantly for abandonment danger. Next, the lack of secure emotional repair was likely in Lena's childhood. Healthy parenting includes rupture and repair. For example, parent becomes frustrated, parent reconnects, child learns relationships survive conflict. But if Lena experienced punishment instead of repair, withdrawal instead of reassurance, the silent treatment, and emotional abandonment after conflict, then she may have learned conflict means loss of love. This helps explain why even small relational tension becomes catastrophic. and chronic shame. Lena appears to carry deep, toxic shame. I ruin people. Everyone leaves. Something is fundamentally wrong with me. Children internalize how caregivers respond to them. If she was treated as burdensome, dramatic, selfish, difficult, or emotionally excessive, she may have absorbed, I am too much to love safely. This belief often sits underneath BPD symptoms. And possible emotional parentification. Lena's hyper-awareness of others' emotional states suggests she may have been forced into emotional caregiving early. And we talked about this as a symptom with complex PTSD. She notices subtle tone shifts, emotional undercurrents, and hidden sadness. This level of relationship scanning often develops in children who had to monitor unstable caregivers, prevent emotional explosions, manage family tension, and anticipate moods for safety. As adults, these children may become emotionally intense, hyper-attuned, exhausted, deeply fearful of disconnection. And an important clinical perspective here is to remember that it's important not to frame Lena's childhood as bad parents create BPD. Not every emotionally sensitive child develops BPD. Most modern theories view BPD as arising from temperament or high emotional sensitivity, plus invalidating or traumatic environments. A child born emotionally intense may thrive with attuned caregivers, emotional coaching, consistent attachment, safe repair. But in chronic or invalidating environments, that same sensitivity can become chronic emotional dysregulation. Here's a compassionate reframe. At her core, Lena's behaviors make sense when viewed through the lens of adaptation. As a child, she likely learned closeness could disappear suddenly, emotions were unsafe, abandonment was catastrophic, and love had to be desperately secured. Those survival strategies helped her emotionally endure her childhood. But in adulthood, the same strategies overwhelm relationships, intensify fear, reinforce shame, recreate the abandonment she most fears. This is often the tragedy and the treatable hope inside BPD. Using the story of Lena, let's talk about what other therapeutic inventions could be useful for her. So beyond DBT, Lena's story suggests several therapeutic approaches that could be highly effective depending on her trauma story, her attachment style, level of dissociation, impulsivity, co-occurring depression, anxiety, or PTSD, and readiness for insight work. The most effective treatment would be interactive rather than relying on a single modality. So taking a more eclectic approach with some of all of these different modalities would be useful in Lena's case. First, we have attachment-based therapy. Lena's core wound appears to be relational. People leave, I'm too much, love disappears. An attachment-focused therapist would help her understand relational patterns, recognize attachment triggers, build secure attachment experiences, tolerate closeness without panic, and the therapeutic goals would be to create emotional safety, repair internal working models of relationships, reduce abandonment sensitivity, and strengthen object constancy. And when we're talking about object constancy, that is the ability to feel connected to someone emotionally, even when they were absent, upset, or unavailable. This is one of Lena's greatest struggles. Trauma therapy. Lena's nervous system appears trauma reactive, especially around rejection and emotional distance. Even if there was no overt physical abuse, chronic emotional instability can create developmental trauma, attachment trauma, and complex PTSD symptoms. Useful trauma approaches may include EMDR, or eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, which is helpful for abandonment memories, humiliation, emotional neglect, and relational trauma triggers. Targets could include childhood rejection, caregiver withdrawal, moments of shame, and perceived abandonment experiences. EMDR could help reduce the intensity of her nervous system responses. Another experiential therapy is somatic therapy. Lena's distress is highly body-based: chest burning, panic activation, physiological overwhelm. Somatic approaches teach nervous system regulation, body awareness, grounding, discharge of survival energy. Helpful modalities are somatic experiencing, sensory motor psychotherapy, and trauma-informed yoga or breathwork. These can help her feel emotions without becoming consumed by them. So the third consideration, mentalization-based therapy. Mentalization-based treatment is especially effective for BPD. Mentalization means understanding both your own mind and the minds of others accurately. When dysregulated, Lena loses this ability. For example, Eli texts late. Lena assumes he hates me, he's leaving, I'm abandoned. MBT helps clients slow down and ask, what else could be true? What might the other person actually be feeling? Am I interpreting or observing? And what state is my nervous system in right now? This reduces splitting, projecting, catastrophic assumptions, and relational chaos. Another therapy is schema therapy. Schema therapy would likely fit Lena extremely well because it targets deep childhood schemas, which are deep, lifelong patterns of behavior. Possible schemas in Lena are abandonment, defectiveness or shame, emotional deprivation, mistrust, and subjugation, leading to unstable identity. Schema therapy helps identify the abandoned child part, the angry protector, the desperate attachment seeker, and the punitive inner critic. This approach can help Lena understand parts of me are reacting from childhood survival states. That often reduces shame significantly. Then we would move on, in his case, to internal family systems. So internal family systems model can help Lena develop compassion towards herself instead of self-hatred. For example, one part fears abandonment, one part attacks others before they can leave, one part feels empty, one part desperately clings, and one part feels ashamed afterward. IFS reframes these as protective parts rather than badness. This can help reduce internal warfare, shame spirals, and self-destructive coping. Another, and probably one of the best things for DBT, is group therapy. Carefully structured group therapy, where we talk about a homogeneous group, which is a group that all have the same diagnosis, and they all start together and travel as a cohort through the counseling process. So carefully structured group therapy can be transformative for someone like Lena. The benefits: practicing relational skills live and in person, learning emotional boundaries, receiving feedback safely, reducing isolation, seeing others struggle similarly. DBT groups are especially helpful because they normalize emotional dysregulation, teach concrete skills, reduce shame. And by attending those groups, it also alleviates how alone they feel in their symptoms. However, poorly managed groups could trigger rejection sensitivity or splitting dynamics. The same as a poorly managed group could trigger any number of things in any number of clients. It's not just DBT clients. So, group fit matters greatly. And then we also have psychoeducation about the nervous system, which I've done a lot of in previous broadcasts where I've talked about the polyvagal nervous system. Lena would likely benefit from understanding attachment trauma, emotional flashbacks, nervous system activation, fight, flight, fawn, and freeze responses. This reframes symptoms from I'm broken to my nervous system adapted to survive. That shift can dramatically reduce self-loathing. And another therapy is identity development work. Lena's unstable self-image suggests therapy should include values clarification, self-definition, autonomy building, independent interests, stable routines, creativity, and self-expression, which are things that I encourage all of my clients to engage in. And mostly none of mine have DBT. They mostly all have dissociation. So important therapeutic questions for someone like me to ask, and for Lena to ask herself, is who is Lena outside of relationships? What does she value? What remains true across emotional states? Without this work, relationships may continue to become her primary identity source. And then we have grief work. Many clients with BPD carry profound unprocessed grief. Grief for childhood, grief for unmet needs, grief for emotional neglect, grief for unstable love, and grief for repeated relational ruptures. Lena's 4 a.m. breakdown in the kitchen suggests this grief is close to the surface. Healing often requires mourning what she didn't receive, who she had to become to survive, how much fear shaped her life. Then we would engage in some self-compassion training. Lena's internal dialogue is deeply punitive. She likely needs explicit help learning self-validation, emotional permission, shame resilience, and compassionate self-talk. Clients with BPD often show compassion to others far more easily than to themselves. Therapy may include practicing statements like, "This feels painful, but it doesn't make me unlovable. Fear is present right now. I can survive this emotion." This sounds simple, but for many BPD clients, it feels radically unfamiliar. The most important clinical insight is that Lena does not fundamentally lack emotion regulation skills because she is weak. She likely never had consistent co-regulation, secure emotional attachment, safe emotional mirroring, reliable soothing, and unstable relational repair. Therapy becomes, in many ways, a nervous system retraining process, an attachment repair process, an identity formation process, and a grief process simultaneously. This is why treatment for BPD is often deep, relational, and gradual, but also why recovery is absolutely possible. Well, that's it for today. I want to thank you for joining me. And again, I apologize for the hiatus that I took. I spent some trying to get things organized, and I am going to be moving back into my RV in September, and then I've got some traveling coming up. So I've been trying to get this apartment reduced down to what I can take back into my RV with me. When I get into my RV is when I'll start video podcasts. And until then, because my office is very messy at this point, because a bunch of stuff is stacked in here that's being packed and gone through. So with that, if you like today's podcast, please give it a like and consider subscribing. And you can also leave a comment. With that, I will be back next week with another client-suggested topic. Have a great week, everybody, and stay woo, my friends.